Sophia Mitchell had always believed she was part of a normal family. She wasn't overly spoiled, nor was she treated unfairly. Her childhood was ordinary, filled with small joys and little struggles like any other child's. But all of that changed the night her mother was rushed to the hospital. The frantic knocking on her bedroom door jolted her awake. And when she opened it, she found her Aunt Claire standing there, her face pale and anxious. "Sophia, you need to pack your things," she said quickly. "Your mom is in the hospital." The word, hospital, sent a wave of fear through her. To a child, hospitals meant something terrible: accidents, sickness, or worse. As she hurriedly stuffed clothes into a bag, she barely registered what was happening. The car ride to her aunt's house was a blur, and no one explained anything. But the real shock wasn't in that night. The true horror came later, when her little sister, Emily, was born nearly 2 months premature. At first, Sophia didn't understand what that meant. She just knew it was serious because suddenly, every adult in her life was consumed with worry. The house felt different, heavier. Conversations became hushed whispers about Emily's condition, and Sophia was kept at a distance from everything. No one explained anything to her, but she figured it out soon enough. She was no longer the center of attention. In the following weeks, she found herself spending most of her time at her aunt's house, with only occasional visits to the hospital. Even then, her mother barely spoke to her. Each time she saw her, she would just offer a tired smile and say the same thing: "Be good, Sophia, mommy is very busy." Sophia learned, very quickly, what that meant. It meant she had to take care of herself. It meant that whatever she wanted, attention, affection, reassurance, she wouldn't get it anymore. When Emily was finally brought home, things only got worse. The house transformed from a place of warmth and comfort into something unrecognizable. It became a sterile fortress where every surface had to be wiped down multiple times a day. The air smelled like rubbing alcohol and disinfectant, so strong that Sophia could still smell it even in her sleep. Her mother became obsessed with keeping Emily safe. She checked the nursery's temperature every hour, washed her hands so often that her skin cracked, and refused to let anyone near the baby unless they had sanitized thoroughly. But the worst part wasn't the strict rules or the suffocating atmosphere. The worst part was the realization that Sophia no longer belonged in her own home. Any sign of illness, a sneeze, a minor cough, was enough for her mother to send her away. If she so much as sniffled, she was packed off to her grandmother's house without hesitation. At first, Sophia thought this was a kindness. She loved her grandmother, who baked with her and let her feel like she mattered. But soon, the truth became painfully clear. She wasn't being sent away because her mother cared for her. She was being sent away because she was a threat. She tried everything to win back her parents' attention. She worked hard at school, hoping they would notice. But when she came home with straight A's, her mother barely glanced at her report card before returning to her list of Emily's medications. When she won first place at the school science fair for her project on renewable energy, her father sighed and told her to store her display board in the garage because Emily might be allergic to the dust from the cardboard. She never knew if that was true or if it was just another excuse to dismiss her. The moment that broke her came when she was 12. For months, she had practiced tirelessly for the school talent show, where she would perform a piano piece she had spent a whole year learning. She had dreamed of seeing her parents' proud faces in the audience, of hearing their applause when she finished. But on the day of her performance, Emily developed a mild fever, just 99 degrees Fahrenheit. Nothing more than a common cold. Yet that was enough for her parents to stay home. She stood on stage that night in a crowded yet empty auditorium. Dozens of parents clapped for their children, but there was no one in the audience for her. 2 weeks later, Emily had a 15-minute flute recital, playing a simple piece that any child could learn in a few days. The entire family attended, both sets of grandparents, her mother, her father, everyone. They clapped, cheered, and spoke of Emily's natural talent, as if she were a musical prodigy. That was the moment Sophia understood. Nothing she did would ever be enough. It didn't matter how hard she tried. It didn't matter what she achieved. In this family, she would always be second to Emily. At first, She hated her sister for it. But over time, she realized it wasn't Emily's fault. Emily had simply learned how to use the situation to her advantage. A little fatigue meant skipping school. A slight headache let her lounge on the couch all day. If she complained about difficult homework, their mother would call the teacher to ask for an extension. Meanwhile, Sophia was expected to handle everything on her own. Sophia didn't hate Emily, she hated how she had been erased from her own family's world. And so, she stopped trying. She accepted that no one would ever cheer for her. So, she decided to clap for herself. If no one would help her succeed, she would carve her own path. She didn't know it yet, but walking away from this family, quietly, without a fight, would be the best thing she ever did. By the time Sophia Mitchell was a teenager, she had long given up on the idea of being noticed. She had spent years trying to prove her worth. But in her family, her achievements never seemed to matter. If Emily, her younger sister, so much as played a simple tune on the flute, the whole family celebrated as if she were a prodigy. But when Sophia brought home a perfect SAT score, her mother barely looked up from helping Emily with her homework. It was a pattern she had come to expect. And eventually, she stopped trying to change it. But if no one else would acknowledge her worth, Sophia would find it herself. The only person who ever truly saw her was her grandmother, Eleanor. While her parents only saw her as an afterthought, her grandmother treated her like she was special. Not because of her achievements, but because she was her. When Sophia was young, she had spent countless weekends at her grandmother's house. Often because her mother sent her away whenever she had even the slightest cold. At first, she resented it, but soon, she realized that Grandma Eleanor's house was the only place where she wasn't invisible. One afternoon, while sitting at the kitchen table, Sophia watched as her grandmother carefully polished an antique ring. The golden band shimmered under the light, its intricate design far more delicate than anything she had ever seen in a modern jewelry store. "Do you know what this is?" her grandmother asked. Holding up the ring, Sophia shook her head. "This is a Victorian-era piece. Handmade," Eleanor explained. She pointed to a small marking on the inside of the band. "And this here? This is the jeweler's hallmark. Every authentic piece has one. And it tells you exactly where it was made. Sometimes even by whom." Sophia leaned in closer, fascinated. "People often dismiss old things because they don't understand their worth," Eleanor continued, "but real value is in the details. The weight of the gold. The way a gemstone reflects light. Sometimes what looks like a cheap trinket can actually be worth a fortune." That conversation changed everything for Sophia. From that day forward, she absorbed everything her grandmother taught her about antique jewelry. She learned how to recognize real gold by its weight, how to distinguish natural pearls from synthetic ones, and how to determine the rarity of a gemstone just by the way it caught the light. It was like unlocking a hidden world that no one else around her even noticed. At school, she still felt like she was stuck in the background of her own life, overshadowed by Emily at every turn. But in her grandmother's small jewelry collection, she found something else: control, knowledge, a sense of self-worth that didn't depend on her parents' validation. One day, when she was 16, she and her grandmother visited a small antique shop downtown. Sophia wandered through the aisles, letting her fingers graze over old brooches, tarnished silverware, and faded pocket watches. And then she saw it, a delicate necklace with a deep green gemstone. It was labeled as costume jewelry, priced at only $20. But something didn't feel right. She picked it up, examining the way the stone caught the light. It wasn't glass, it had depth. Something synthetic stones didn't have. She turned the clasp over and saw a tiny engraving, barely visible. Her heart raced. She called her grandmother over, excitement bubbling inside her. "Look at this," she said, barely able to contain herself. "I don't think this is just a cheap necklace." Eleanor took the piece from her, inspecting it with the trained eye of someone who had spent decades in the world of antique jewelry. A slow smile spread across her face. "You have a good eye, sweetheart," she said proudly. "This isn't costume jewelry. It's an antique emerald pendant, probably late 1800s. Sophia's hands trembled as she put it back down. She had spotted something even the shop owner had overlooked. That moment changed something inside her. For the first time, she had proof that her instincts, her knowledge, and her ability to see what others missed had value. Not because someone told her it did, but because she saw it for herself. From then on, she dedicated herself to learning more. She read books on gemstone authentication, studied auction house catalogs, and spent hours in online forums where experts debated the authenticity of rare pieces. While her peers obsessed over prom and dating, Sophia was researching the history of Cartier designs and learning how to identify forgeries. Her parents still didn't care. At dinner, when she tried to tell them about a rare brooch she had read about, her father barely listened before changing the subject to Emily's upcoming school play. It was frustrating, but Sophia had stopped expecting anything different. But she also stopped needing their approval. Because she had found something more important, a world where her knowledge meant something. Where she wasn't invisible. By the time she graduated high school, she had already built an impressive expertise in antique jewelry, while Emily's biggest accomplishment was being voted most popular in the yearbook. Sophia had started making small commissions by helping people authenticate their inherited jewelry. Her grandmother was the only one who recognized how much she had accomplished. "You've always been special, Sophia," Eleanor told her on the night before she left for college. "One day, the rest of the world will see it too." She didn't know it yet, but that day would come sooner than she ever imagined. Sophia Mitchell left for college without a single goodbye from her parents. She wasn't surprised when she announced she had received a full-ride scholarship to the University of Michigan. Her mother sighed as if Sophia had just inconvenienced her, then muttered, "That's so far away. Emily's going to miss you." Emily, of course, had been thrilled. "Great," she had smirked. "When you leave, I'm taking your room. I need more space for my TikTok videos." On move-in day, Sophia's parents didn't bother coming along. Instead, it was Aunt Claire who drove her, handing her a small envelope before leaving. "This is from your grandmother," she said. Inside was a modest check, money her grandmother had quietly saved from her pension. Just for Sophia. It wasn't much, but it was everything. For the first time in her life, Sophia was truly on her own. She wasn't afraid of hard work. She had spent her entire childhood being self-sufficient while her parents poured all their energy into Emily. She juggled classes, worked part-time at a local coffee shop, and spent every free moment buried in books, not just textbooks, but anything she could find on antique jewelry, auction history, and authentication techniques. While other students spent their weekends partying, Sophia scoured online auction sites, antique forums, and estate sales, sharpening her skills. She knew she wouldn't get the luxury of failing. She had no safety net. No parents willing to bail her out if things went wrong. 4 years later, she graduated with honors. Her parents barely acknowledged her degree. But that no longer mattered. She had a plan, and she wasn't going to waste time waiting for approval that would never come. She landed her first job at a prestigious auction house in Chicago, specializing in rare and antique jewelry. The work wasn't glamorous at first, cataloging endless pieces of jewelry, double-checking historical records, and handling items that most people dismissed as old trinkets. But Sophia paid attention. She watched how senior appraisers worked, studied every detail, and most importantly, trusted her instincts. One day, while going through a collection of estate jewelry, she found a brooch labeled as a replica. Something about it didn't sit right with her. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands, feeling its weight. The craftsmanship was too refined, the engravings too precise. A cheap replica wouldn't have such detailing. Quietly, she spent the next 2 days researching. She scoured old auction catalogs, cross-referenced jeweler hallmarks, and checked historical records. Finally, she found what she was looking for. This was no replica. It was an authentic Art Nouveau brooch from the early 1900s, created by a renowned designer. She took her findings to the auction director. He barely glanced at the piece before dismissing her. "It's a copy," he said. "You're new, Mitchell. Don't waste time on this." But she didn't back down. She laid out her evidence, explaining the specific markers that proved its authenticity. By the time she finished, the director was no longer dismissive. The brooch was pulled from the replica pile and re-evaluated. When it finally went to auction, it sold for $58, a far cry from the few $100s they had initially priced it at. For the first time, people noticed her. She was no longer just another junior employee. The senior appraisers started paying attention. She was given bigger cases, more responsibility, and access to high-profile clients. She had earned their respect, not because of luck, but because she had proven herself. But there was one thing she quickly realized: no matter how successful she became at the auction house, she would always be working for someone else. She could authenticate $1 million piece and only see a small bonus. She wanted more, not just money, but control over her own future. So she made a bold decision. She withdrew her savings, took out a small loan, and rented an office, a tiny space above a Chinese restaurant in a not-so-great part of Chicago. The smell of food clung to the walls. The Wi-Fi barely worked, and her entire setup consisted of a folding table from Goodwill and an old chair she found on the street. But it was hers. She started small, offering lower rates than the big companies, working with antique dealers and independent collectors. She built her reputation one appraisal at a time, ensuring her clients received the true value of their pieces instead of being misled by larger firms looking to underpay. 6 months in, a turning point arrived. A private collector approached her to authenticate a family heirloom collection. Sophia worked tirelessly for 2 weeks, analyzing every stone, every engraving. She discovered 2 extraordinarily rare pieces that had previously been misidentified as fakes. When the collection went to auction, it sold for over $900, and her commission was 10%. She sat in her tiny office, staring at her bank account, unable to process it. $90. More money than she had ever seen in her life. That was when she knew she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building something real. With that money, she upgraded her office to an actual business space with functioning air conditioning, a secure showroom, and a small team. She hired her first employee, Jenny, a recent gemology graduate who reminded Sophia of herself. Within 2 years, her company expanded to New York and Miami. She built connections with major auction houses, worked with elite collectors, and became one of the most trusted names in luxury jewelry authentication. And the funniest part? Her family had no idea. They still thought she worked at some little antique shop. Every time she visited home for dinner, she played the role of ordinary Sophia. "You're still at that same place, right?" her mother would ask. "Yeah, still the same," she'd reply with a small smile. Her mother would nod approvingly, still seeing her as unremarkable. Meanwhile, that morning, Sophia had closed a $500 authentication deal. Her family had spent years making her feel like she wasn't enough. Now, she was more successful than they could ever imagine, and she didn't need their validation. She had built her own empire, and no one could take that away from her. Sophia Mitchell had spent years building her career, carving out a name for herself in the world of antique jewelry authentication. By the time she turned 30, she had transformed her small, one-room office into a thriving business with multiple locations across the country. She had spent long nights studying, working tirelessly to prove herself, and now she had the kind of financial security most people only dreamed of. But despite all of this, she still held onto a quiet connection to her family, even if they never acknowledged her accomplishments. When she heard that her parents were struggling financially, she made a decision she never expected to make. Even though they had spent most of her life ignoring her in favor of Emily, Sophia couldn't bring herself to let them lose everything. Without telling them, she set up an anonymous transfer of $7,000 into their bank account each month. She never asked for a thank you or even an acknowledgement. She just wanted to make sure they were okay, even if they would never do the same for her. For 2 years, she sent money without a word, never expecting gratitude. She assumed they would simply use the funds to stabilize themselves, to keep their home and maintain their lifestyle. She never expected what happened next. One evening, during a routine family dinner she had reluctantly agreed to attend, she overheard a conversation that sent a cold shock through her. As she sat at the table, listening absently to Emily's endless self-praise, Her mother suddenly turned to her younger daughter and smiled warmly. Emily, we are so grateful for everything you've done for this family, she said. If it weren't for you, we wouldn't have been able to keep the house. Sophia froze, her fork hovering over her plate. What do you mean? She asked, her voice carefully neutral. Her father leaned back in his chair, nodding in agreement. Emily has been helping us financially for years, he said. She's been so generous, making sure we never had to struggle. A slow, sinking realization settled over Sophia. Emily, who had never worked a day in her life, was taking credit for the money she had been sending. And worse, their parents actually believed her. Emily gave her a smug look, sipping her wine as if nothing was wrong. It's nothing, she said modestly, as if she were some kind of hero. Sophia set her fork down carefully, staring at her sister, at her parents, at the sheer audacity of the lie. She had spent years being invisible to them. But this was something else. They had erased her entirely. For a moment, she considered saying nothing. It wasn't as if she expected them to appreciate her anyway. But then something inside her snapped. She had spent too long letting them take advantage of her kindness. Too long being overlooked. I'm sorry, she said, her voice steady. But that's not true. Her mother frowned. What do you mean? Sophia exhaled slowly, forcing herself to remain calm. I've been the one sending you money, she said simply. For 2 years, $7,000 every month. Silence fell over the table. Her mother's face went pale, and her father's expression hardened. Emily blinked once, then forced out a laugh. Sophia, don't be ridiculous, she said, her voice strained. But Sophia didn't waver. Check your bank statements, she said. The transfers came from an anonymous source because I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. But if you really believe Emily has been funding your lifestyle, ask her to show you where the money came from. Her father's mouth opened as if to argue, but no words came out. Emily's expression shifted from amusement to unease. Her mother, however, quickly recovered. Even if that's true, she said briskly, it's all the same. We're family. You're supposed to help. Sophia let out a breath of disbelief. You didn't even know it was me, she said. And now that you do, you still can't just say thank you? Emily crossed her arms, her false confidence returning. You have money, she said flatly. You should want to help us. Sophia looked at them all. Really looked at them, and saw the truth she had been ignoring for far too long. They didn't see her as a person. She was just a resource to them. An ATM they could withdraw from when needed. She had spent years hoping that maybe, just maybe, they would recognize her efforts. But they never would. A quiet calm settled over her. Well, she said, standing up, you won't have to worry about it anymore. Her father's eyes narrowed. What does that mean? It means the transfers stop today, Sophia said simply. No more money. No more support. Her mother's mouth tightened. Sophia, be reasonable. We're your family. Sophia gave a small, tired smile. You only remember that when you need something, she said. Emily scoffed. You're just being dramatic. Sophia picked up her purse. No, she said. I'm finally being smart. As she walked out of the house, she felt lighter than she had in years. They would call. They would text. They would try to manipulate her into changing her mind. But for the first time, she wouldn't answer. She had spent a lifetime trying to prove her worth to them. Now, she finally understood. She never had to. Sitting in her penthouse apartment, looking out over the Chicago skyline, Sophia Mitchell took a slow sip of wine and let out a quiet breath. It had been 6 months since she had cut off her family. And in that time, she had felt nothing but relief. No more desperate phone calls. No more manipulative emails. No more guilt-tripping messages disguised as concern. The silence was peaceful. For the first time in her life, she was free. It hadn't been easy to walk away, but she knew it had been necessary. She had spent years hoping to earn her family's respect, only to realize that they had never truly seen her as a person. To them, she had only ever been a backup plan, a source of financial support when things got difficult, an obligation rather than a daughter or a sister. Cutting them off wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming her own life. At first, the messages had been relentless. Her mother had sent a stream of emails, each one shifting between anger and desperation. Sophia, how could you be so selfish? After everything we've done for you, this is how you treat your family? Then, hours later, another message, this time more pleading. Your father isn't sleeping. He's so worried about our future. Won't you reconsider? Emily, of course, had been even more dramatic. Taking to social media to play the victim, she posted vague statuses about betrayal, about how money changed people, about how some people forgot where they came from. The comments poured in from distant relatives and family friends, all expressing their sympathy for poor Emily and her struggles. Sophia didn't respond. She didn't block them either. She didn't have to. She knew that silence would hurt them more than anything she could ever say. They had spent years ignoring her, dismissing her, making her feel invisible. Now, they finally knew what it felt like. Despite their insistence that they didn't need her, the cracks in their carefully constructed world began to show. Word reached her through Aunt Claire that her parents were struggling to make mortgage payments now that their mysterious benefactor had disappeared. Emily, who had never held a stable job in her life, was suddenly faced with a reality she had never prepared for. The luxurious lifestyle she had flaunted on social media was unsustainable without a steady stream of financial support. And the debts she had hidden were beginning to pile up. Sophia didn't feel satisfaction at their downfall. She didn't wish them harm. She simply didn't care anymore. She had spent too much of her life carrying their burdens. And now, for the first time, she was focused on herself. Her business had flourished in the months since she had walked away. Without the weight of her family's expectations dragging her down, she had thrown herself into her work, expanding her company even further. Her reputation as one of the most trusted jewelry authenticators in the country had only grown. And new opportunities were constantly appearing. She had secured deals with elite collectors, major auction houses, and international clients. What had once been a small side business had become a multi-million-dollar enterprise. And through it all, her family had no idea. They still thought of her as the girl working in a tiny antique shop. The forgettable daughter who had never quite been enough. Even when they had discovered her wealth, they hadn't seen her success as her own. They had simply viewed it as a resource to be shared, something they were entitled to. But they had never understood what it took to build something from nothing. They had never known the long nights, the sacrifices, the endless hours of work that had gone into creating what she had. They had never respected her. And they never would. A year after she had cut them off, she received an unexpected phone call from Aunt Claire. She hesitated before answering, but curiosity got the best of her. Aunt Claire sounded hesitant, almost embarrassed, as she explained why she was calling. Your parents are moving, she said. They couldn't keep up with the house payments. They're downsizing. Emily too. She's not handling it well. Sophia could picture it perfectly. Emily, who had spent years parading her designer bags and luxury vacations, now forced to adjust to a reality she had never imagined. No more expensive shopping sprees. No more high-end dinners. No more effortless privilege. For the first time in her life, Emily would have to figure things out on her own. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Your mother asked me to call you, Aunt Claire admitted. She wants to talk. Sophia smiled faintly. She's sorry now, isn't she? I think she understands things differently now, Aunt Claire said carefully. Sophia thought about it for a moment. The girl she had been a year ago might have said yes. Might have given them another chance. But she wasn't that girl anymore. I appreciate you calling, Aunt Claire, she said finally, but I have nothing left to say. She hung up, placing her phone face down on the table. Outside, the city lights stretched endlessly before her, glittering against the night sky. She had built this life for herself, free from the expectations and obligations that had once defined her. She had spent years searching for validation from people who would never give it to her, only to realize that she had never needed it in the first place. She had chosen herself, and she had never been happier. Sophia's story is a powerful reminder that success is not about proving yourself to those who refuse to see your worth. It's about recognizing your own value and refusing to let others define it for you. Too often, people stay trapped in toxic relationships, whether with family, friends, Or colleagues, because they fear walking away. But true growth begins when you set boundaries, protect your achievements, and prioritize your own well-being. Sophia didn't cut off her family out of spite. She did it because she finally understood that she didn't owe them her success. She worked for it, built it from the ground up, and refused to let guilt or manipulation take it away from her. Her journey teaches us that financial independence is not just about money, it's about freedom. Freedom to make choices, to walk away from what no longer serves you, and to live life on your own terms. At the end of the day, the people who truly matter are the ones who respect you, not the ones who only see you as a resource. What do you think about Sophia's decision? Did she make the right choice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more powerful real-life lessons.